This is the sermon for Friday night, May 24th, and the title is Toxic Masculinity. So, a few months ago, somebody mentioned the phrase toxic masculinity. It seemed an interesting description of machismo, macho, and of course, toxic would obviously be anything that is poisonous. A man, therefore, per the phrase, who is engaging in certain behaviors would be hurting himself and maybe or probably others as well. And perhaps this is because men are bound to a specific series or pattern of behavior that can be personally and socially detrimental. So some people long for the days when men were men and women were women. And what does that mean? Simply that men were engaged in masculine behavior and women were engaged in feminine behavior. Men were strong and tough, women were gentle, soft, and feminine. Men were dominant, women were submissive. Pretty cut and dry. In the olden days, in an agricultural society, men and women had specific roles. Women gave birth and were on a higher spiritual plane because they gave birth, and they stayed home with the kids, cooked and cleaned, and lit the Shabbat candles, and basically imbued the kids with social mores. Men, on the other hand, went out to the fields or pastures to labor all day and basically win the bread. On Shabbat, men went and prayed all day because they were brutes and needed all those extra commandments to keep them focused and controlled. They wore tzitzits to remind them of those commandments and to keep their masculine urges at bay. Then came equal rights. First was women's suffrage, then working career, then bursting the glass ceiling, and now equal pay. Women want to be doctors, lawyers, captains of industry, combat soldiers, bodybuilders with lots of defined and bulging muscles, and MMA fighters. Where does that leave men? What has happened to the distinction that made men men? In the modern day, when we now have more choices with our lives, women are pushing to fulfill themselves outside the home. They were now competing with men in men's fields. And by the way, the whole idea of the standard of living rising and the need for two-income households kind of helped push that in a little bit. They already had the freedom of emotional expression, women did, intrinsically, and now we're involved in highly competitive careers. They have it all. Part of the point of toxic masculinity is the expression of feelings that women can have and men can't or don't. Women express their feelings very freely. Men are stoic. Crying is seen as giving into pain, almost a sign of weakness. But for women, it's kind of a tactical release. Men tough it out because they're, well, men. Men don't give in to piddly emotions. We are strong and we do whatever it takes. We know what happens with other kids at grade school when a male child shows emotion or fear or, heaven forbid, cry. That's all well and good, but this toxic masculinity seems to describe a situation in which men hold it in, don't express their pain, and then it builds and builds and builds, and the next thing you know, you have an irate temper tantrum. So expressing feelings is good, right? Well, what does the Torah say? Yes, it talks about men and women not wearing each other's clothes. For some, that is a metaphor that each gender has their own role. God made everything masculine and feminine, according to Genesis, and we don't mess with God's intention, or does it? Does that mean that women can't fulfill themselves in the workplace and academia? Men were losing their gender advantage, and more important and consequential, their dominance and identity, and thus felt threatened. How can men feel good about themselves as men if they're on an equal footing with women? What now makes a man, and one of whom he can be proud? All those things that make a man are now almost the domain of a woman. Many feel that men need to loosen up. When a man has intense feelings, why not use crying as a release if appropriate? After all, the Torah has example of people coming together after extended periods of time, like Jacob and Esau, and crying and embracing each other. So stoicism, at least in the Torah, doesn't make a man less of a man. In fact, it's very culturally appropriate. Now, this is merely one example. While the Torah talks about our ancestors and how they expressed themselves fully, the men were still men. Jacob, with his emotional displays and releases, still supported 4 wives and 13 children and was the Israel after whom we are all called. The real implications of all those characteristics of a man are tied to, you guessed it, self-esteem. I will tell you that I've experienced some of this myself. Years ago, a friend was training me in martial arts. It was his turn to roundhouse kick the pad that I held up. And I was holding it too close to my face, and he kicked the pad into my face. So I just got ready for the next kick with my face turning red and my eyes tearing from the blow, smiling the whole time. He stopped, of course, to make sure I was all right, and then he gave me a moment to recover. Toxic masculinity. We men have to learn to appreciate ourselves. If we want to express feelings like cry over frustration and hurt, we do it. And nobody's going to tell us otherwise, because we can still be strong and have that release as a catharsis and then go on and deal with the issues. That doesn't make us any less of a man. Real men don't eat quiche. Hey, real men eat whatever the fill in the blank they want.